The HOA maintenance crew was already mowing my lakefront grass before sunrise. Their yellow machines crawled across land I had inherited 2 weeks earlier, while Linda Whitmore stood beside the clubhouse telling workers to ignore my stop notice. Behind her, the Oak Ridge Estates pool, parking lot, tennis courts, and community center all sat on my 1,300 acres. Dozens of residents gathered near the entrance. Watching like this was just another neighborhood dispute. It was not. I controlled the ground lease under every amenity they used, every parking space they claimed, and every recreational acre their monthly dues depended on. That was the mistake Linda did not understand. The smell of cut grass hung heavy in the morning air. Sprinklers clicked across the lawn. A mower blade rattled over a metal survey cap near the sidewalk, and that sound snapped through me louder than any shouted threat. I walked toward the clubhouse with my boots wet from dew and a certified letter folded in my hand. The letter had arrived the night before. It said the HOA rejected my ownership claim and demanded I stop interfering with community operations. Community operations. On my land. Linda turned when she saw me coming. She was 56, polished, calm, and dressed in a white blazer that looked too clean for 7 in the morning. Her silver SUV sat near the clubhouse steps with the engine still running. She held a clipboard against her chest and smiled like she had already won. "Mr. Bennett," she said, loud enough for the residents to hear. "This property has served Oak Ridge for 30 years. You cannot just appear and start making demands." A few people nodded behind her. That was the part that stayed with me. They were not angry yet. They were comfortable. They believed the clubhouse belonged to them because every brochure, newsletter, and HOA meeting had told them it did. I looked past Linda at the lake. Morning light shimmered across the water. Children's bicycles leaned against the pool fence. Golf carts lined the parking area. A banner near the clubhouse advertised the upcoming summer festival. Every inch of it sat on land recorded under my grandfather's estate. My name is Ryan Bennett. I am 41 years old, and I manage commercial property for a living. Leases, rent schedules, renewal windows, maintenance obligations, I read T. The mower rolled forward and struck the metal cap again. Clang. The sound echoed across the lawn. Several residents turned toward it. The worker shut the machine off and climbed down to inspect what he had hit. Linda immediately waved him away. Too quickly. That caught my attention. Mini hook. People rarely rush past something they are comfortable explaining. I walked toward the survey marker while the morning sun climbed higher over the lake. The grass smelled freshly cut. Sprinklers clicked in steady rhythms. Water droplets sparkled across the clubhouse lawn. The worker stepped aside as I crouched near the cap. A brass survey marker sat flush with the ground. The engraving was old, but still visible. Property boundary reference. My grandfather's surname was stamped across the lower edge. I brushed dirt away with my thumb. Several residents moved closer. Nobody said a word. Linda folded her arms. "That marker means nothing," she said. "The community has used this property for decades." I stood up slowly. "Then you should not mind me reviewing the lease." Her smile returned. Polished. Practiced. Not entirely natural. That tiny flicker from earlier had disappeared. But I remembered it. Some details stay with you. I spent the rest of the morning driving the property. Oak Ridge Estates occupied only a small section of the inherited acreage, but it was the most valuable section. The clubhouse sat near the lake. Walking trails wrapped around the shoreline. Tennis courts, playgrounds, and parking lots connected everything together. Hundreds of families used those amenities every week. The scale became obvious once I looked at it from above. Around noon, I parked near a ridge overlooking the community. Warm air drifted through the truck window carrying the scent of pine mulch and fresh pavement. I opened the estate files again. My grandfather's attorney had organized everything carefully. Property maps, tax records, survey references, lease summaries. The deeper I read, the stranger the numbers became. The annual ground lease payment was lower than what some residents probably spent on cable television. That was not an exaggeration. I checked the figure 3 times. Then a fourth. Mini hook. One number can expose an entire system. By late afternoon, I arrived at the attorney's office handling the estate. The building smelled like paper, leather, and old wood polish. Sunlight stretched across shelves lined with binders. A woman named Karen Mitchell greeted me and led me into a conference room. She had worked with my grandfather for years. "You have questions," she said before I even sat down. I nodded and slid the lease summary across the table. She adjusted her glasses and studied the page. "That agreement generated more conversations than you would believe," she said quietly. That answer immediately created 10 new questions. She opened a file cabinet and removed a thick folder. The folder looked older than some of the residents living in Oak Ridge estates. Inside were correspondence records, lease amendments, inspection notes, and renewal notices. Page after page revealed the same pattern. The HOA never owned the land. They leased it. They always leased it. The distinction seemed obvious now. Yet nobody inside the community behaved that way. Not even Linda. Especially not Linda. We reviewed documents for nearly 2 hours. The deeper we went, the more one detail stood out. Every renewal notice referenced a master lease stored separately from the routine files. A master lease. Karen frowned when she reached that section. Then she checked another folder. Then another. Her expression changed slightly. The master lease was not there. I felt the room grow quieter. Outside, traffic moved through downtown streets. Inside, neither of us spoke for several seconds. The most important document connected to the property was missing from the estate files. Karen finally closed the folder and looked directly at me. "Your grandfather kept that one himself." Then she mentioned something I had never heard before. There was a safe on the ranch that nobody had opened since the funeral. The safe sat behind a row of dusty shelves in my grandfather's workshop. Late afternoon sunlight spilled through narrow windows and stretched across the concrete floor. The air smelled like machine oil, cedar wood, and old paper. I stood in silence for a moment, looking at the heavy steel door. Everything around it felt frozen in time. Tools hung exactly where he had left them. A faded ranch calendar still marked a month from 3 years earlier. The safe looked ordinary. That was what made it interesting. Mini hook. Important things rarely advertised themselves. Karen had given me the combination from an old estate record. I turned the dial slowly. Metal clicked inside the mechanism. The final latch released with a deep thud. Dust drifted into the sunlight as I pulled the door open. Inside sat several folders, a small lockbox, and a stack of neatly labeled binders. No cash. No jewelry. No family secrets. Just paperwork. My grandfather always trusted documents more than stories. I carried everything to a workbench and started sorting through it. Property surveys, tax assessments, correspondence, lease renewals. Years of records filled the binders. Then I found a dark blue folder marked simply, Oak Ridge Master Lease. My pulse slowed. That was always a good sign. Fast excitement causes mistakes. Slow focus finds answers. I opened the folder carefully. The paper smelled old. The original agreement had been signed decades earlier. Multiple amendments followed. Renewal notices sat behind them. Handwritten notes filled several margins. I read every page. Then I read them again. By sunset, one thing became crystal clear. Linda Whitmore had built her authority on assumptions. The lease did not transfer ownership. It never had. The HOA leased the land beneath every major community amenity. Clubhouse, pool, lakefront, parking lots, recreation areas. Everything. Mini hook. The deeper I read, the less Linda's confidence made sense. Then I reached a section near the back. A renewal clause. I stopped reading and started studying. One paragraph had been underlined in red ink by my grandfather years earlier. The clause allowed periodic rent reassessment based on market value during specific renewal windows. I checked the dates, then checked them again. The most recent reassessment should have happened years ago. According to the records, it never did. I leaned back in my chair. Outside, cicadas buzzed across the ranch. Wind moved through the oak trees. The workshop felt unusually quiet. A missed reassessment was not a small oversight. The difference between historic lease rates and current market rates could be enormous. I grabbed a calculator and began running numbers. The result made me stare at the screen. The HOA was paying a fraction of what comparable ground leases commanded across the region. Not half. Not even close. A fraction. The next morning, I contacted a commercial valuation firm. By noon, I was sitting in a conference room reviewing preliminary estimates. Large windows overlooked downtown traffic. The smell of fresh coffee drifted across the table. The analyst reviewed maps and acreage figures while entering data into a laptop. She did not know anything about Linda or Oak Ridge politics. She only knew property values. That was exactly what I needed. When she finished her calculations, She slid the estimate across the table. The updated market lease value was more than 5 times the current rate. 5 times. I felt several pieces click into place at once. Suddenly, the missing reassessment mattered. The master lease mattered. The survey marker mattered. Even Linda's brief reaction outside the clubhouse mattered. She had recognized the document header immediately because she already knew the lease existed. The question was whether she knew about the reassessment clause. Late that afternoon, my phone rang while I drove back to the ranch. The caller ID displayed Oak Ridge Estates HOA. I answered. Linda's voice came through the speaker calm and controlled. Too controlled. She did not ask about ownership. She did not ask about the survey marker. She asked whether I had found the master lease. Then she offered to meet that evening. Something about her timing felt very deliberate. Linda chose the clubhouse patio for the meeting. The sun had already disappeared behind the lake when I arrived. Soft landscape lights reflected across the water. Crickets chirped from the shoreline reeds. The smell of fresh mulch and chlorine drifted through the evening air. Several residents still lingered around the pool area, but most had gone home. Linda sat alone at a round table overlooking the lake. A leather folder rested beside her. She smiled as I approached. The same polished smile. The same calm posture. Yet tonight it looked more deliberate. More careful. Minnie Hook. People become cautious when the conversation finally reaches facts. I sat across from her and placed the master lease on the table. Her eyes moved to the folder immediately. Not surprise. Recognition. That told me enough. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Water splashed softly from a decorative fountain near the clubhouse entrance. Golf carts rolled through the parking lot. Everything looked peaceful. The tension sat entirely between us. You found it faster than I expected, Linda said. I opened the folder and turned to the reassessment clause. You knew it existed. She glanced at the page. I knew there was a lease. Not the same answer. I noticed that immediately. Did you know about this clause? I asked. Her expression barely changed. Barely. There are many clauses. Another careful answer. Another answer that avoided the question. Minnie Hook. Direct questions reveal more through evasions than admissions. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Linda spoke about community traditions, resident expectations, property values, neighborhood stability. She described Oak Ridge as if it were a small city. Hundreds of families, shared amenities, decades of growth. Everything she said sounded reasonable. That was the problem. She never discussed ownership. She discussed reliance. There is a difference. Eventually, she opened her own folder. Inside were newsletters, meeting minutes, community plans, and development proposals. One document caught my attention immediately. An expansion concept map. New walking trails. Additional recreation areas. A larger clubhouse wing. Expanded parking. The proposed improvements extended deeper into my acreage than the existing facilities. I looked up slowly. You were planning expansion? Linda folded her hands. The board has been evaluating future opportunities. Future opportunities. The phrase sounded harmless. The map did not. Several proposed additions sat entirely outside the current leased footprint. My leased footprint. Nobody had contacted me. Nobody had requested permission. Nobody had even mentioned the idea. The realization settled heavily across the table. While I was still reviewing inheritance records, the HOA had been discussing growth on land they did not own. The fountain continued splashing behind us. Somewhere across the lake, a dog barked. Linda watched me carefully. She knew I understood the significance now. The community has invested a great deal here, she said quietly. We all benefit when things remain stable. Stable. Another interesting word. Stability for the HOA meant maintaining lease rates established years ago. Stability meant avoiding reassessment. Stability meant keeping residents unaware of the actual arrangement beneath their amenities. I left the meeting shortly afterward. The drive back across the ranch felt different. Headlights swept across fences and open pasture. The night air carried the scent of cedar and dry grass through the truck window. My mind kept returning to the expansion map. Not the clubhouse. Not the reassessment clause. The expansion map. Someone had invested time and money developing plans that assumed continued control of land they did not own. That level of confidence rarely appears by accident. The next morning, I requested copies of every HOA board meeting record connected to future development discussions. By noon, a response arrived from the HOA attorney. The letter was short. Too short. They declined the request. Then they included something unexpected. A statement claiming the community possessed rights extending beyond the written lease. I read the sentence 3 times. Then I looked at the date attached to the document they cited. Something about it immediately felt wrong. The date on the document bothered me all afternoon. I sat in my workshop with the HOA attorney's letter spread across the workbench while sunlight faded through the windows. The smell of cedar and old paper filled the room. Outside, wind moved through the pasture fences. Inside, I kept staring at the same line. The HOA claimed rights extending beyond the written lease. Their argument depended on a supporting document dated nearly 20 years ago. The problem was simple. That document referenced a board structure that did not exist yet. Mini hook. Dates rarely lie, but people sometimes do. I pulled additional records from the estate files and began building a timeline. One document led to another. Board meeting minutes, community newsletters, property maps, annual reports. By evening, index cards covered half the workshop wall. The timeline told a very different story than the one Linda was presenting. Oak Ridge Estates had expanded gradually over the years. New amenities appeared. New landscaping projects appeared. New recreation areas appeared. Yet every improvement seemed to assume permanent control over leased land. Nobody questioned it because the arrangement had existed for decades. Familiarity had become ownership in people's minds. Around 8 o'clock that night, Karen Mitchell called. Her voice sounded unusually serious. She had reviewed copies of the documents cited by the HOA attorney. "Ryan, there is something else you need to see," she said. The next morning, I met her at the estate office. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The building smelled like coffee and floor polish. Karen already had several folders waiting on the conference table. She slid one toward me. Inside was a collection of correspondence between my grandfather and previous HOA leadership. Most of it was routine. Maintenance questions, renewal notices, landscaping requests. Then I found a letter written nearly 12 years earlier. My grandfather had rejected a proposal to expand community facilities beyond the existing lease footprint. I read the letter twice, then a third time. The language was direct. Expansion required separate approval. Expansion required separate compensation. Expansion required separate negotiation. None of those things had happened. Mini hook. Suddenly, the clubhouse map from Linda's folder looked much more important. Karen handed me another document. This one came from a consultant hired years earlier to evaluate community growth. Options. Several recommendations were highlighted. One sentence stood out immediately. Future expansion should not be assumed without landowner participation. I leaned back in my chair. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. People had raised concerns before. Those concerns had simply been forgotten or ignored. By noon, I drove through Oak Ridge again. Children played near the pool. Residents walked around the lake. Lawn crews trimmed hedges near the clubhouse entrance. Everything looked normal. That was the strange part. The community itself was not the problem. Most homeowners had no idea what was happening. They paid dues, attended meetings, trusted the board. The real issue sat inside conference rooms and legal letters. The issue lived in assumptions. As I drove past the clubhouse, I noticed several signs advertising an upcoming town hall meeting. Linda's name appeared prominently across every banner. Community Vision Forum, Future Growth Discussion, Development Planning Session. I parked across the street and studied the schedule. The meeting would take place in 3 days. That timing felt interesting. Very interesting. Later that afternoon, another valuation report arrived from the commercial appraisal firm. The final numbers were even stronger than the preliminary estimate. The gap between current rent and market rent was enormous, larger than I originally believed. I sat quietly for several minutes reviewing the figures. Outside, thunder rolled across distant hills. Rain clouds gathered above the ranch. The reassessment clause from the master lease suddenly carried real weight. Not theoretical weight, financial weight. The kind that changes conversations very quickly. Then my phone buzzed with a community email forwarded by a homeowner. Linda had just announced a major presentation at the town hall. According to the notice, she planned to reveal Oak Ridge's next phase of expansion. The town hall meeting filled the clubhouse before sunset. Every chair was occupied. Residents lined the walls holding paper agendas and cups of coffee. Ceiling fans turned slowly overhead. The smell of fresh carpet cleaner mixed with popcorn from a refreshment table. Near the entrance, outside, Storm clouds gathered above the lake. Inside, Linda Whitmore stood confidently beside a large projection screen. The expansion maps were already displayed. New trails, additional parking, a larger recreation center, more amenities, more spending, more land. My land. Mini hook. Nobody in the room seemed to realize that detail yet. I took a seat near the back and watched. Linda moved through the presentation smoothly. She spoke about community growth, property values, long-term planning, future opportunities. Residents nodded along. Several applauded. The atmosphere felt more like a celebration than a business meeting. Then she displayed a rendering of the proposed expansion area. My eyes immediately locked onto the map. The highlighted section extended well beyond the current lease boundaries. Far beyond them, a few people around me leaned forward with interest. They saw walking paths and landscaping improvements. I saw acreage controlled by a leaseholder acting like an owner. Linda continued speaking. Not once did she mention leased land. Not once did she mention the master agreement. Not once did she mention reassessment rights. The omission felt deliberate. Mini hook. Sometimes what is missing matters more than what is shown. After nearly 40 minutes, the meeting opened for questions. Residents raised concerns about construction schedules and community dues. Others asked about parking improvements and lake access. Linda handled each question easily. Then I stood up. The room became noticeably quieter. She recognized me immediately. Several homeowners turned to look. A few already knew who I was. Most did not. Does the expansion plan include land outside the existing lease footprint? I asked. The question hung in the room for a moment. Linda smiled politely. The board has reviewed all relevant considerations. Another non-answer. Several residents glanced at each other. I remained standing. That was not my question. More silence. The projector hummed softly behind her. Rain tapped against the clubhouse windows. Linda adjusted her notes. Future planning discussions are ongoing. There it was again. Another answer without an answer. The mood in the room shifted slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. People were paying closer attention now. One homeowner near the front raised his hand. Wait, are you saying the HOA does not own all this land? Heads turned across the room. Linda responded quickly. Too quickly. The community has operated successfully for decades. That response landed differently than she intended. Because nobody had asked about operations. They asked about ownership. Mini hook. The wrong answer often reveals the real problem. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Small groups formed around the clubhouse. Conversations grew more serious, less celebratory. Several residents approached me in the parking lot. The smell of rain filled the evening air. Lightning flashed beyond the hills. People asked reasonable questions. Who owned the land? What did the lease say? Was expansion actually approved? Most seemed surprised. Not angry. Surprised. The board had never discussed those details publicly. Later that night, I returned to the ranch and reviewed the valuation report again. The final market analysis sat beside the master lease on my workbench. Numbers covered the pages. Large numbers. Numbers supported by current commercial land values, comparable properties, and professional assessments. The difference between existing rent and market rent remained staggering. I sat quietly listening to rain strike the workshop roof. Then I opened the master lease to the reassessment clause once more. The language was clear. The timing requirements were clear. Everything was clear. By midnight, I finished drafting a formal notice. The document would trigger the reassessment process the HOA had avoided for years. I printed the final page and placed it beside the valuation report. Then my phone buzzed with an email from Linda's attorney. The subject line contained only 4 words. We need to talk. The meeting with Linda's attorney took place 2 days later in a conference room overlooking downtown. Morning traffic moved below the windows. The smell of coffee and printer toner filled the air. Rain from the previous night still clung to the glass outside. I arrived carrying the master lease, the valuation report, and the reassessment notice. Linda was already there. She sat beside her attorney with a tablet and several folders neatly arranged in front of her. Her expression remained calm, controlled, professional, the same expression she had worn from the beginning. Mini hook. Calm people become very interesting when numbers enter the room. The attorney started politely. He spoke about cooperation, community stability, long-standing relationships, shared interests. Then he shifted toward the reassessment notice. He described it as disruptive, potentially harmful. Unnecessary. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I slid the valuation report across the table. The room grew quiet. He reviewed the numbers carefully. Linda did not touch the report. She already knew what it contained. That much was obvious. These figures are aggressive, the attorney finally said. These figures are market-based, I replied. Neither of us looked away. For several seconds, only the hum of the air conditioner filled the room. Then Linda spoke. The community cannot absorb an increase of that size. There it was. Not ownership. Not rights. Not legal objections. Cost. The conversation had finally reached the real issue. Mini hook. People stop arguing principles when the math stops working. We spent nearly 2 hours discussing alternatives. Payment schedules. Review periods. Potential negotiations. Yet every proposal shared the same goal. Delay. Stretch the process. Push the decision further into the future. By the end of the meeting, nothing had been resolved. As I packed my documents, Linda made one final comment. The residents will not react well to this. It sounded less like a warning and more like a prediction. That prediction arrived quickly. Within days, Oak Ridge community forums exploded with rumors. Emails circulated. Social media posts appeared. Residents debated everything from ownership rights to future dues increases. Some blamed the HOA board. Others blamed me. Most simply wanted answers. I could not entirely blame them. For years they had been told one version of the story. Suddenly another version existed. Confusion filled the gap. One afternoon, I stopped by a small diner near the edge of town. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted through the room. A homeowner recognized me and introduced himself. Then another joined the conversation. Soon 4 residents sat around my table asking questions. Real questions. Respectful questions. They wanted to know whether the HOA actually owned the clubhouse land. They wanted to know whether expansion plans were real. They wanted to know why nobody had discussed the lease publicly. The questions kept coming. I answered carefully. Facts only. No speeches. No accusations. By the time I left, something had changed. Information was starting to move beyond board meetings and attorney letters. Information was reaching homeowners directly. Mini hook. That worried some people more than the reassessment itself. The following week, another board meeting was announced. Attendance records shattered previous numbers. Residents filled every seat. Extra chairs lined the walls. Late arrivals stood in the back. Linda opened the meeting with her usual confidence, but the atmosphere felt different. More alert. More skeptical. Hands shot into the air before she even finished her introduction. Questions came from every direction. Lease terms. Expansion maps. Ownership records. Future obligations. The board struggled to maintain control of the discussion. For the first time since inheriting the property, I saw uncertainty spreading through the leadership team. They were no longer speaking to a passive audience. They were speaking to people demanding details. After the meeting ended, I walked through the parking lot beneath bright floodlights. The air smelled of wet asphalt. Conversations continued around me in small clusters. Nobody seemed ready to go home. My phone buzzed as I reached my truck. A new email had arrived from the commercial appraisal firm. The subject line contained only 6 words. Updated analysis following expansion review. Then I opened the attachment and saw a number that changed everything. The number on the appraisal report was almost double the previous estimate. I sat in my truck beneath the clubhouse floodlights and stared at it while conversations continued across the parking lot. The smell of wet asphalt drifted through the open window. Residents were still gathered in small groups discussing leases, expansion plans, and board decisions. None of them knew what I had just learned. The revised analysis included the proposed expansion areas Linda had showcased at the town hall. Those future development zones dramatically increased the underlying land value. The higher the land value became, the more significant the reassessment clause became. Mini hook. The expansion plan was making the problem worse, not better. I drove back to the ranch under a sky full of low clouds. Headlights swept across fences and cattle guards. The master lease sat on the passenger seat beside the appraisal report. Every few miles, I glanced at it again. The numbers remained the same. By the time I reached the workshop, I already knew what came next. The reassessment notice would move forward exactly as written. The following morning, sunlight spilled across the workbench as I reviewed everything one final time. The smell of coffee filled the room. Estate records sat stacked beside valuation reports. Survey maps covered part of the wall. The timeline I had built over the past weeks now stretched across nearly 12 feet of corkboard. Looking at it all together revealed something interesting. Every major conflict traced back to the same assumption. Oak Ridge leadership had acted as though low lease rates would continue forever. They planned around it, budgeted around it, expanded around it. Nobody seemed prepared for the possibility that the contract might actually be enforced. Around 10 o'clock, Karen Mitchell arrived at the ranch. She reviewed the updated appraisal figures in silence. Then she compared them against the reassessment language in the master lease. Page by page, line by line. Finally, she looked up. "The notice is supported," she said. For simple words. Yet they carried enormous weight. Mini hook. Validation changes the tone of a fight. By noon, the formal reassessment package was ready. Certified copies. Supporting valuation documents. Lease references. Market comparisons. Everything organized neatly inside a thick envelope. I drove directly to the post office. The clerk weighed the package and applied the mailing labels. The sound of the date stamp hitting the receipt echoed through the lobby. That moment felt surprisingly quiet. No dramatic speech. No confrontation. Just paperwork moving through a system exactly as it was designed to move. 3 days later, the reaction arrived. My phone started ringing before breakfast. First came homeowners, then local reporters, then 2 board members I had never met. By lunchtime, the entire community seemed aware that a reassessment notice had been delivered. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some residents claimed the lease payment would double. Others claimed the clubhouse would close. One rumor suggested the community might lose access to the lake entirely. None of those stories were accurate. Yet panic has its own momentum. Late that afternoon, I drove past Oak Ridge and immediately noticed something different. The usual confidence was gone. Residents stood in clusters throughout the property. Conversations stopped when vehicles approached. Bulletin boards near the clubhouse displayed emergency meeting notices. The atmosphere felt tense, uncertain, as if everyone had suddenly realized there were details they should have asked about years ago. Then another surprise surfaced. A homeowner emailed me copies of several recent board newsletters. Most looked routine. Maintenance updates, event schedules, budget discussions. One paragraph caught my attention immediately. It described future expansion funding projections based on long-term facility costs. The projections assumed lease expenses would remain essentially unchanged for years. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time. The board had not merely hoped for stable lease rates. They had built future financial plans around them. Mini hook. Assumptions become dangerous when they enter budgets. The next evening, Linda finally responded publicly. A special board statement appeared on the community website. She described the reassessment as unexpected, unnecessary, and harmful to residents. She promised the board would challenge it aggressively. The statement ended with a sentence that immediately grabbed my attention. According to Linda, the HOA possessed evidence that could invalidate the entire reassessment process. Then she attached a document I had never seen before. The document appeared on the community website just after sunset. I sat at the workshop desk with my laptop open while rain tapped softly against the windows. The smell of coffee and old paper filled the room. Outside, darkness settled across the ranch. Inside, I opened the attachment Linda had referenced in her statement. The file was labeled as a supplemental agreement connected to the ground lease. My eyes moved across the first page, then the second, then back to the first. Mini hook. Something felt familiar before I understood why. The document claimed to limit future reassessments under certain conditions. If valid, it could complicate everything. I printed a copy and spread it beside the master lease. The signatures looked legitimate. The formatting looked professional. The language sounded convincing. Yet one detail kept pulling my attention. The paper referenced a lease amendment number that did not exist anywhere in the estate records. That alone did not prove anything. Missing files happen. Clerical mistakes happen. But the inconsistency stayed with me. The next morning, I drove directly to Karen Mitchell's office. Low clouds hung over town. Traffic moved slowly through wet streets. Karen reviewed the document in silence while I watched her expression. Halfway through the second page, she stopped. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Mini hook. Experienced attorneys rarely pause without a reason. She opened several estate folders and began comparing records. Lease amendments, correspondence logs, filing indexes. One stack became two, then three. Nearly an hour passed before she finally leaned back in her chair. "I have never seen this document before," she said. That answer carried weight. Karen had handled portions of the estate for years. If a major amendment existed, she should have known about it. We continued digging. By midday, another inconsistency appeared. The supplemental agreement referenced a board authorization meeting supposedly held almost 15 years earlier. Karen located the actual meeting minutes from that date. I read every page carefully. Budget discussions, landscaping contracts, pool maintenance, community events. No mention of lease amendments. No mention of reassessment limitations. No mention of negotiations with my grandfather. The silence inside those records spoke loudly. Later that afternoon, I contacted the commercial appraisal firm. I wanted a complete breakdown of how future development plans affected land value. The analyst walked me through the numbers during a video call. Expansion potential increased the underlying valuation significantly. New amenities, additional parking, larger recreation facilities. Every proposed improvement increased the importance of the reassessment clause. Every future project made the lease more valuable. By the time the call ended, the financial picture was clearer than ever. The community had built ambitious plans on assumptions that no longer matched reality. Mini hook. The numbers were no longer the HOA's biggest problem. The paperwork was. 2 days later, another special board meeting took place. Attendance overflowed into the parking lot. Residents filled every available chair. Folding seats lined the walls. Some homeowners stood near the entrance holding printed copies of Linda's public statement. The atmosphere felt completely different from earlier meetings. More serious, more skeptical. Questions started immediately. Several residents asked about the supplemental agreement. Others asked why it had never been mentioned before. Linda maintained her composure. She explained that historical records were complex, that ongoing legal review limited discussion, that the board was protecting community interests. Her answers sounded polished, yet the room remained unconvinced. I could feel it. People were no longer accepting reassurances without evidence. Then something unexpected happened. A retired homeowner named Walter stood up near the back. I recognized him from earlier meetings. He rarely spoke. Tonight was different. Walter explained that he had served on a committee years ago during one of the community planning reviews. He remembered discussions about lease concerns. He remembered concerns about future reassessments. Most importantly, he remembered being told that no amendment had ever changed the original reassessment rights. The room became very quiet. Linda's expression tightened for the briefest moment. I noticed it immediately. Others did too. After the meeting ended, Walter approached me in the parking lot beneath the bright lights. Rainwater reflected across the pavement. He carried an old storage box under one arm. "I found this in my garage last week," he said. Inside were committee notes, archived correspondence, and meeting packets dating back more than a decade. Then he handed me a folder marked Lease Review Working Group. I opened it and saw a name on the first page that changed the entire direction of the dispute. The name at the top of the folder belonged to Thomas Reed. I stared at it for several seconds beneath the parking lot lights. Rainwater shimmered across the pavement. Homeowners continued leaving the clubhouse behind us, unaware that a single name had just become the most important piece of the entire dispute. Thomas Reed had served as Oak Ridge's legal advisor years before Linda became president. More importantly, his signature appeared on multiple lease review documents inside Walter's archive box. Mini hook. People leave traces long after they leave positions. I thanked Walter and drove back to the ranch. The folder sat on the passenger seat beside the master lease. Wind pushed against the truck as I crossed open stretches of pasture. By the time I reached the workshop, midnight was approaching. The smell of coffee and cedar greeted me as I switched on the lights. I opened the folder immediately. Inside were committee notes, internal memoranda, meeting summaries, and legal correspondence. Every page seemed connected to lease concerns. Every page seemed connected to reassessment discussions. Then I found the document that stopped me cold. It was a summary prepared by Thomas Reed for a committee review more than a decade earlier. The language was straightforward. The reassessment clause remained active. The landowner retained the right to initiate market adjustments during designated review periods. No amendment had removed that right. No supplemental agreement had changed that right. No special exception had altered that right. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time. The wording could not have been clearer. Mini hook. Sometimes the answer arrives in plain language. The next morning, I contacted Karen Mitchell and sent digital copies of everything from Walter's archive box. Less than an hour later, she called. Her voice carried a level of energy I had not heard before. She wanted an immediate meeting. By noon, we sat together reviewing the newly discovered material. Sunlight streamed through the conference room windows. Traffic noise drifted faintly from the street below. Karen organized the documents into separate stacks while making notes. Every few minutes, she circled another section with a red pen. The pattern emerging from the records was becoming difficult to ignore. Years earlier, community representatives had specifically reviewed the reassessment clause. They discussed it, analyzed it, acknowledged it, then continued operating as though it did not exist. The distinction mattered enormously. Forgetting a clause is one thing. Knowing about a clause and planning around it is something else entirely. Karen eventually reached the final section of the folder. There, buried among committee records, sat a copy of correspondence between Thomas Reed and several board members. One sentence immediately stood out. The committee should not assume lease costs remain static indefinitely. I watched Karen underline the line without saying a word. The room felt unusually quiet afterward. Mini hook. One sentence can destroy years of assumptions. Over the following week, pressure inside Oak Ridge continued growing. Homeowners demanded more transparency. Questions filled community forums. Emergency board updates appeared almost daily. Linda remained publicly confident, but her statements became increasingly careful. Every announcement seemed written by attorneys. Every response avoided specifics. Meanwhile, the supplemental agreement she had released received closer scrutiny. The more people examined it, the more questions surfaced. Missing references, unclear filing history, inconsistent meeting records. Nothing definitive yet, but enough to create doubt. Then another development arrived unexpectedly. Thomas Reed himself contacted Karen's office. He was retired now and living several states away. He had heard about the dispute through former colleagues. More importantly, he requested a video conference. 2 days later, we sat together in Karen's office while his face appeared on a large screen. He looked older than the photographs in Walter's folder, but his memory remained sharp. He reviewed several documents during the call. Then we showed him the supplemental agreement posted by the HOA. Silence followed. Thomas adjusted his glasses and studied the page carefully. Nearly a minute passed. Finally, he leaned closer toward the camera. I remember discussions about limiting reassessment concerns, he said. But I never approved anything that replaced the original clause. Nobody in the room spoke. Even through the screen, the weight of that statement was obvious. Then Thomas asked a question that immediately changed the direction of the entire case. He wanted to know where the original version of the supplemental agreement had come from. The question stayed with me long after the video conference ended. Where had the original supplemental agreement come from? Not a copy, not a summary. The original. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across Karen's office as we reviewed every document again. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Outside, traffic moved steadily through downtown streets. Inside, nobody spoke for several moments. Thomas Reed's statement had changed everything. He had not denied discussions. He had denied approving any document that replaced the reassessment clause. That distinction mattered. Mini hook. Sometimes the most important answer is the one a witness refuses to confirm. Karen began tracing the filing history. County records, estate records, HOA records. Every version of the lease-related documents followed a predictable path. Filing references, archive numbers, meeting authorizations, approval dates. The supplemental agreement stood alone. It lacked the same documentation trail supporting every other major amendment. That absence became impossible to ignore. 2 days later, the dispute moved into formal mediation. The meeting took place inside a neutral conference facility near the county courthouse. Residents were not present. Attorneys were. Financial consultants were. Representatives from the HOA board filled one side of the room. I sat with Karen on the other. Linda arrived carrying a thick binder. She looked composed as always. Professional. Controlled. Yet there was something different now. Her confidence seemed measured rather than automatic. The room felt quiet before the discussion began. Air conditioning hummed overhead. Water glasses sat untouched on the table. Mini hook. Silence often arrives before difficult facts. The mediator opened with procedural remarks. Then the conversation turned toward the reassessment notice. Financial projections appeared on presentation screens. Valuation reports were reviewed. Lease language was analyzed. For hours, both sides presented arguments. Nothing unexpected happened at first. Then Karen introduced the committee records from Walter's archive box. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Copies circulated around the table. Thomas Reed's legal summary circulated with them. Several board members read the documents carefully. One exchanged a glance with another. Linda remained silent. The mediator asked a simple question. Had previous leadership been aware of the reassessment clause? Nobody answered immediately. The hesitation spoke volumes. Karen followed with another document. Then another. Committee notes. Advisory memoranda. Planning reviews. Every piece pointed in the same direction. Historical awareness. Historical acknowledgement. Historical concern. The reassessment clause had not been hidden. It had been discussed repeatedly over the years. The room grew noticeably quieter. Minnie Hook. Patterns become difficult to dismiss when every document points the same way. Then the supplemental agreement entered the discussion. Linda's attorney presented it carefully. The mediator reviewed it. Karen reviewed it again. Questions followed. Filing history. Approval records. Authorization references. Supporting documentation. The same questions kept returning. Where had the original originated? Who maintained custody? Which board approved it? The answers became increasingly vague. During a short break, I stood near a window overlooking the courthouse square. Rain clouds drifted across the horizon. Pedestrians moved along the sidewalks below. For the first time since inheriting the property, the outcome felt less uncertain. Not because we had won anything, because the facts had finally gathered in one room. When the session resumed, the mediator requested one final review of the historical record. A large timeline appeared on screen. Lease creation, renewals, committee reviews, expansion proposals, estate records. Every major event stretched across decades. Looking at it all together revealed a simple truth. The HOA had built future plans around assumptions rather than documented guarantees. The expansion proposals, the budget forecasts, the financial projections. Everything depended on lease conditions remaining frozen indefinitely. Yet the contract itself never promised that outcome. Linda finally spoke near the end of the session. Her voice remained calm. She acknowledged that the community faced difficult decisions. She acknowledged that future planning assumptions might require revision. It was the closest thing to a concession anyone had heard from her. Nobody celebrated. Nobody reacted dramatically. The moment felt too important for that. As the meeting ended, participants gathered their folders and prepared to leave. The mediator announced that a formal recommendation would be issued soon. Chairs slid across the floor. Papers disappeared into briefcases. Conversations resumed quietly around the room. Then Karen handed me a newly arrived county archive response. The first line immediately caught my attention. They had located a record connected to the supplemental agreement. The county archive response arrived the next morning. I opened the email while standing in the workshop doorway watching sunlight spread across the ranch. The air smelled like fresh grass and cedar. Birds moved between fence posts. Everything outside felt calm. The document in my hands promised the opposite. Minnie Hook. Sometimes a single archive record can outweigh years of arguments. I drove directly to Karen's office. By the time I arrived, she had already reviewed the preliminary summary. Several folders waited on the conference table. The county had located a filing reference connected to the supplemental agreement. More importantly, they had located the chain of custody attached to that filing. We started reading immediately. The archive record confirmed that a document had been submitted years earlier. However, the submission description did not match the version currently being circulated by the HOA. I read the line twice. Then a third time. The filing referenced an administrative review memorandum, not a lease amendment. Not a reassessment limitation, not a replacement agreement. An administrative review memorandum. The distinction changed everything. Karen requested the complete archive package immediately. By late afternoon, additional materials arrived electronically. The room fell quiet as we opened them. Page after page appeared on the screen. Filing logs, processing notes, administrative correspondence. Then we found the memorandum itself. It was not even close to the document Linda had presented publicly. The memorandum discussed community concerns regarding future lease costs. It recommended financial planning. It recommended budgeting. It recommended contingency preparation. It never altered the lease. It never removed reassessment rights. It never modified ownership terms. Mini hook. The document everyone feared turned out to say the opposite. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. For weeks, the supplemental agreement had hovered over the dispute like a storm cloud. Now the underlying record told a completely different story. Karen organized copies and immediately forwarded them to the mediator. She also forwarded them to the attorneys representing the HOA. The response arrived faster than expected. Within hours, another mediation session was scheduled. The atmosphere inside the conference facility felt noticeably different this time. Nobody wasted energy on introductions. Everyone already understood the stakes. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Water glasses sat untouched once again. The mediator opened the session by displaying the county archive materials. Silence filled the room. The filing references appeared first, then the memorandum, then the supporting records. One by one, the pieces lined up. The supplemental agreement being used publicly could not be connected to the archive chain supporting the original filing. The discrepancy was obvious. Not dramatic, not emotional, just obvious. Several board members looked down at their documents. Linda remained composed, but she spoke less than before. Her attorney reviewed the materials carefully and asked several procedural questions. The mediator answered each one. The facts remained unchanged. The archive records supported the memorandum. The memorandum supported the lease. The lease supported reassessment rights. Piece by piece, the foundation beneath the HOA's position weakened. Mini hook. Facts move slowly until they suddenly move all at once. By the end of the session, the conversation shifted away from whether reassessment could occur. The discussion became about how the community would adapt. Financial projections appeared on screen. Budget scenarios followed. Alternative approaches were evaluated. Some options involved phased increases. Others involved operational adjustments. For the first time, nobody argued that the reassessment clause did not exist. Nobody argued that ownership belonged to the HOA. Those battles were effectively over. The focus had changed. Outside the mediation room, homeowners continued demanding updates. Community forums remained active. Questions still circulated daily. Yet the tone had changed there too. Less panic, more realism. People were beginning to understand what had actually happened. Years of assumptions had collided with a contract that never changed. A week later, the mediator released a formal recommendation. Karen and I reviewed it together. The document was thorough. Historical records, archive findings, lease analysis, financial implications. Every major issue received attention. The recommendation strongly supported enforcement of the reassessment process under the original lease terms. I set the report down and looked out the window. Late afternoon sunlight reflected from nearby buildings. Traffic moved steadily below. After months of uncertainty, the path forward finally looked clear. Then Karen pointed to the final section of the recommendation. One paragraph in particular. It addressed future negotiations between the landowner and the HOA. The first sentence made me stop reading and start smiling. Linda would need to make a decision very soon. Linda made her decision 8 days later. The meeting took place inside the same clubhouse that had stood at the center of the entire dispute. Morning sunlight reflected across the lake outside. Residents filled every seat. Some stood along the walls. Others watched through open doors leading to the patio. The smell of coffee and fresh pastries drifted through the room. Ceiling fans turned slowly overhead. Everything looked familiar, yet the atmosphere felt completely different. The uncertainty that had dominated previous meetings was gone. People wanted answers now. Real answers. Mini hook. After months of arguments, the facts had finally caught up with everyone. Linda stood at the front beside several board members. Her usual confidence remained, but it had changed. Less certainty, more acceptance. She reviewed the mediator's recommendation carefully. Historical records, archive findings, lease obligations, financial realities. Nothing was hidden anymore. Residents listened quietly. No interruptions. No applause. Just attention. Then she acknowledged what many homeowners had already concluded. The reassessment process would move forward. The room remained silent for a moment. Outside, a breeze moved across the lake. Inside, years of assumptions finally settled into reality. Over the following weeks, negotiations replaced conflict. Attorneys still participated, Financial consultants still reviewed numbers. Yet the tone changed completely. The goal was no longer winning. The goal was adaptation. Several proposals were exchanged. Payment schedules were revised. Long-term planning models were updated. Future expansion concepts were reevaluated. The community had to build its future around actual lease obligations rather than imagined ones. Mini hook. Reality is easier to manage once people stop fighting it. One afternoon, Linda and I met privately on the clubhouse patio overlooking the water. The same patio where we had argued months earlier. The same lake. The same walking paths. The same property. Only the conversation had changed. She placed a revised agreement on the table between us. No speeches. No dramatic declarations. Just paperwork. We reviewed every section carefully. Market-based lease adjustments. Future review procedures. Expansion requirements. Communication standards. Clear rules. Clear expectations. Clear accountability. The kind of structure that should have existed all along. When we finished, Linda signed first. I signed second. The sound of two pens clicking closed seemed strangely significant. The dispute that had consumed so many months ended with signatures rather than confrontation. That felt appropriate. The problem had always been paperwork. The solution was too. By the end of the season, visible changes appeared throughout Oak Ridge. Community budgets became more transparent. Financial planning became more realistic. Board meetings became better attended. Residents asked more questions. Fewer assumptions survived. Several expansion projects were postponed. Others were redesigned entirely. None of those changes destroyed the community. In many ways, they improved it. People finally understood how the system actually worked. Knowledge replaced speculation. Facts replaced rumors. Accountability replaced comfort. Mini hook. Communities tend to become stronger when reality enters the conversation. Months later, I drove through Oak Ridge on a quiet evening. Children rode bicycles near the lake. Families walked along the shoreline paths. The clubhouse lights reflected across the water. Life continued. Most residents no longer viewed me as the outsider who disrupted their neighborhood. Many now understood that the conflict had never been about taking something away. It had been about recognizing what already existed. A lease. A contract. An obligation. The documents had never changed. People's assumptions had. As the sun disappeared behind the hills, I stopped near the old survey marker where the mower blade had struck metal on that first morning. The brass cap still sat flush with the ground. My grandfather's surname remained visible across its surface. Wind moved through the grass. Crickets filled the evening air. I thought about the missing records, the committee notes, the valuation reports, the crowded meetings, and the endless conversations. Every major twist had started with one simple fact. Ownership matters. Not because it creates power, because it creates responsibility. The clubhouse remained busy behind me. The lake remained full. The community remained intact. The difference was that everyone finally understood the ground beneath their feet.